Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal podcast. Our guest today is Karl Simon. Karl is the CTO of Subatomic, building AI co-workers that help wealth management firms automate workflows and scale without adding headcount. Karl, thanks for taking the time to chat.
Yeah, thank you, Krish. I'm happy to be
My
here and talking
pleasure.
with your great audience.
Oh, thank you for that. Before we get into the topics, we have quite a few of those, Karl. If you can give a quick introduction about yourself and your company and what you folks do.
Yeah, so hey, I'm Karl Simon. I'm co-founder, CTO of Subatomic. Now, before I joined Subatomic, I've had a long history, a long experience set crossing 30 years of helping companies modernize based upon the latest technologies that are introduced to the market. From the early days when data warehousing was tip of the iceberg opportunity to modernizing for the digital world, social media, mobile, big data, machine learning, and now with generative AI democratizing the accessibility of doing things with AI. I'm helping companies now get on board with that with sophisticated capabilities through Subatomic. And we believe at Subatomic, you hire AI, as Chris just noted, not buy software. More on that in a bit.
Thank you for that. There's a lot of experience and there's plenty to learn from you the next 60 minutes. So, without further ado, let me jump right in. For starters, we would like to understand a little bit more about subatomic. If you could just take, I know you have a few different products, but if you could take one, it doesn't matter which one, and sort of tell us a little bit about what problems specifically it aims to solve. Like, who are your customers, like the ideal customer, and what problems you expect for them to have, and how does your solution help them address those issues?
Yeah, a fantastic example is in the financial services vertical, specifically in wealth management domain, where we have a client who originally was a pessimistic prospect, turned excited, heavily satisfied uh, customer, and then became our lead investor in our seed round that closed last October. So we saw many opportunities in the back office so that they can, any wealth management firm with their advisors can focus in the front office, growing your book of your AUM, your revenue, your profit. So examples there included things that are really labor intensive, currently for many wealth management firms. Whether you're preparing for a client meeting, and perhaps your top tier ones you meet with monthly or at least quarterly, and there's information spread out and fragmented across many different systems. You know about the custodial systems, risk management, retirement, estate planning, tax planning, all that information along with your email, your calendar, your CRM, your ERP, and your SharePoint or other document storage devices. You need to bring all that information together, both structured, unstructured, and unified data model to be able to perform impactful use case execution. And so when you think about that client meeting prep, you need the full visibility across the information that spans all that information with a 360 view, with your cognitive intelligence through our AI coworkers, because you should hire AI to do your work and work with you. We actually, we basically eliminated 8,000 hours of labor across, the entire advisor team there. And now they can actually grow their business and they're doing just that.
Okay, that's a good start. I have a bunch of questions there to unpack slowly but surely. So let's say a lot of the data that you mentioned, you said structured and unstructured data. So I'm imagining this, and maybe our audience will as well as we go along. The customer that you mentioned, right? One of your customers, they have data in disparate places in disparate forms and shapes, and they need to make sense of the data in the context of whatever it is they're going to be doing, perhaps the interaction that they're going to have with their client, for instance. So at the 50,000 foot call, are we talking about a RAG based system that goes into all of their data repositories and finds information that that person actually needs to get onto those conversations?
It's RAG plus, and the plus is significant. So start with the RAG, you can find semantic similarity for sure. Semantic relevance, you know, is improved if you do it in a hybrid RAG way with both semantic search and BM25, indexing. But contextually relevant really is more fully accurate when you understand your clients and the different services you provide, the different requirements that client may have, the profile of the client, everything that is required across all your services that again begin with your financial management all the way through tax management, estate planning, how they all interconnect in a true complex cognitive interrelated understanding. So then when you perform RAG, it's contextually guardrailed and bounded within the contextual relevance of those interrelatedness of those different entities. And we capture that in a knowledge graph. That's critically important. That's where the plus comes in. And to do it right is tricky, but we handle the tricky, we handle the complex.
So how does your architecture look like? Say, what are some tools like to get your piece of the puzzle working? What are some tools and technologies that you use? And also if you could give us to the extent that you're able to share sort of a high level architecture, because like I mentioned, our audience is predominantly an engineering audience. So everyone's generally curious to know how companies and individuals are using the latest and greatest technologies to help solve their problems. So you could speak to maybe any LLMs that you're specifically using, maybe the languages that your dev team is generally working on, and also some of the AI tools. Perhaps you're using some services from one of the hyperscalers, possibly maybe one of those, or maybe using some neo cloud, for instance. So just a good high level overview of some of the tools in your repertoire, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. Before I begin on the tools within the stack, I'll state that for security, which we take very seriously, it's subatomic, and we embed a lot of our own rigor into the defensibility of your systems and your data. We deploy in your cloud provider with you as the tenant of the account, or if you want an on-prem, so that we'll adapt and adopt into your security measures as minimum. We bring a value add. But then the tech stack of building includes everything from, having, a React component in the UI that can be dynamically displayed, even generated at runtime based upon the nature of a request. We use Python as a primary language because in case, you know, the customer wants a co-management, and we find that once in a while where there's a hybrid support model between client and subatomic, that we actually make sure that the languages that we choose are ones that are predominantly, available, in most of our clients. For the stack, everything from the database, we choose the database that is best for you. Quite often we'll use Postgres because it's a fantastic database at a much lower cost, but Snowflake, Databricks, you name it, we support and build on top. The engineering framework is LangChain, and as a predominant one, we also use others, for different types of agentic deployments as necessary. But LangChain mostly with LangGraph in support of agent graphical building or building the graphs, and then LangSmith for basic tracing, which we augment more fully through extended auditing logs and bring it to fruition in a highly visible, observable way for our clients.
Okay, a couple of things to unpack there. One, you said you are able to deploy your products in the client's infrastructure. That's quite similar to say we do a few things. One of the things we do is sell APIs, and we exactly provision have support for something of that nature. But what I want to understand is, so yours is, let's say if I, for a new customer, maybe it's a small customer, do you provide is it a SaaS application where people can just go online, self onboard, sign up, and start leveraging, or do they need to find a place for them to deploy this, be it on-prem or their cloud servers essentially?
At the moment, predominantly, we deploy it in their cloud provider or on their premises. Never say never, but right now we're not a SaaS player. We are actually a custom build define it for you in your location.
Okay, so then I need to understand a little bit more. So you also mentioned a few different databases of the client's choice. In other words, I was imagining a product. Our product is, we have a set of dependencies, and when we deploy them in the client's infrastructure, right, be it AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, doesn't matter.
Right.
It's essentially using our code, our dependencies, our libraries, and our database. We use Mongo, we use others as well. So
Yeah.
that stack does not change. It's just the deployment and where this code lives and runs happens to be in one or the other servers. But in your example, you mentioned people can pick whether they want Postgres, whether they want maybe some other database, for instance. How does that work? Because your code, I imagine, is it written for, for a variety of systems? And how does that work? Like, why, one, is it written for multiple systems? And two, why would you want to write it for those? Because why not say, hey, your dependencies are Postgres or VV8 or Oracle, for instance, and that's where you're going to be storing your data.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you asked that question, Krish. And there are two important reasons of why Subatomic does it your way. And if we were using my company backdrop, you would see AI your way. I'd be able to point into my background screen. Basically, two things. One, we don't want to actually complicate your architecture. We want to make it easy to adopt. And we'll talk more about how you interface or how you interact with your chief of staff that is a part of Subatomic more at the application level in a moment. But even when it comes to adopting technology, we want to make it easy and not overcomplicate the number of different platforms you may have. So when I say users have a choice, if they don't have a platform of choice, we typically use Postgres. But if they may already be building a data lake or a data warehouse that might be on Databricks or Snowflake, for example, or SQL Server or Oracle. And so we're not going to tell them you have to rip it out. Maybe they're already paying for licenses. We're trying to reduce the cost of entry into working with Subatomic. And so, in other words, working with Subatomic means easy adoption from a technology perspective, from a user adoption perspective, and I hope we talk about that more. And that's part of our process. Now, the second part of that answer is that we're only a 13 human being team, but we have over 100 AI coworkers, including our own data AI coworker data engineers and software engineers. And so we're able to port into any platform rapidly core code that can actually just understand the specific dialects of different systems and how to interact.
Okay, which means, does it mean when you go work with a customer that has say a slightly different setup from your previous one, do you have different adapters that connect to a database of their choice? In other words, let's say if you work with Snowpal, for instance, and one of our next APIs, we're looking to use a vector database like VV8 as it, for example.
Right.
Let's say that happens to be a data store, and we're like, hey, Carl, we know that's what you guys need to use. So would you actually have adapters for a variety of these data stores for you to be able to support what the client actually currently does use?
When the database has a different structure, whether it's key value versus relational versus graph, we have adapters that convert data as necessary. But generally speaking, it's less about predefined adapters and more we have code conversion capabilities so that when we are working with a different solution, we have that specific dialect of the code that should be used.
Okay, I think I have an idea, and I'll probably hold that for now and jump into something
Let me
slightly.
let me
Sorry,
make it
yeah.
more concrete, Krish. In other words, if you're using maybe use AWS Redshift, right? But you may want to move, or you want to use Snowflake, which we're offering. We can actually convert from a Redshift to a Snowflake dialect with minimum impact. But if you're changing the nature of the structure of the information, maybe it's more object relational, maybe it's, again, some of the other examples I gave you, from key value data stores to graphical representations of the same. We convert the code to adapt and adopt to what systems you have if you want to preserve those systems and not add more. Now, if you're okay with adding more, that's also an easy option for us to fulfill too.
Makes sense. And is this, you talk, let's talk quickly about the ability, every customer is going to be unique in their own way, right? And your model particularly relies on the fact that, hey, we're not going to ask you to change what you're possibly using or doing, but we'll sort of seamlessly find our way into your ecosystem. So you'll have to make the least amount of changes to be able to leverage your products and services, which makes sense because, people are going to, the least friction there is to integrate, the more chances people are going to integrate. But is the reason that you're able to support a variety of these variations and adapters of this kind, Carl? Is it because now code does not have to be written? It's sort of a segue, but I want to still understand that it's because your dev team now does not have to write all of the code like every other dev team on planet Earth these days. That you're able to generate a chunk, a good significant percentage of that code, so you have a version, you have a second version, you go work with a third client, you slightly have a modified third version. Now, if your fourth client comes along, wants something different, is it because you're able to use these three code bases or adapters as examples, feed it into your AI tool, so to speak, and have that generate the fourth version that's unique to that client? Is that, I'm assuming a bunch of things here, so it could be completely off, but I just want to start the conversation there. Is that a possible reason that you're able to be this flexible, that the code, a lot of it is being generated these days?
It is, but something that I want to articulate as a boundary and what I'm going to further define based on your question is that we don't reuse custom code across clients. Again, AI your way, we want customers to feel like they're getting a differentiated version that actually represents the way they think about their data, the way they execute their workflows through standard operating procedures, the way they reason and make decisions from a cognitive layer perspective. But yes, Krish, I mean, for things that are more standard, industry standard components that everyone shares as a foundational understanding of how to, you know, reflect their domain and actually bring it to life through technology. There is a foundational floor. And whether it's fulfilled by agents from our factory floor that are skilled up on domain specific skill sets, and then applying the custom specific SOPs and cognitive knowledge, those first two layers are reusable modules up until we deliver something that's specific to a client at that highest level. Whether it's agents that are being built up that way or full features that we build into modules that are standard for the industry, we use that as starting points, and then we can build off the custom layer on top of it. So that allows basically an assembly line, to get to the point of, okay, now that we're going to run discovery with you as our client, we'll know exactly what your way of doing things is, and we'll apply that at the highest level that will only be for you.
Makes sense. Can you give us another example of perhaps even a second financial client or a non-financial client that uses your product right now, Carl, just so I can get a broader perspective and then ask something? Because I have a few questions, but I want to make sure those are in the context of what you're doing. So maybe a second example might help my understanding a little bit more.
Yeah. So in manufacturing, we work with a high-end oven confection manufacturer who also provides maintenance and support. One of the first use cases that they wanted to achieve was auto-generating a report after the field service tech went into the field, evaluated a broken oven, for example, and identified the root cause and documented the whole diagnostic process before arriving at the root cause and the resolution applied. And so this could be a multi-day visit, and the whole report had to be well-defined and executed, but you had a team of tech, field service techs that did it very differently, and the quality varied. And that's important both for information capture by HeatTech, the actual provider, and making sure there's a level of quality always provided as that report is sent out to the customer as a part of the overall, here's what we discovered, here's what was done. So we used AI to basically apply not just best practices in forming an entire report, the type of content that goes in, but also the cognition that heat tech uses to basically diagnose and support actually the field service itself, the diagnostics and root cause resolution, pulling up the related documents through hybrid RAG, and then that is contextually bounded within the knowledge graph tree of thoughts, and then basically auto generate a quality that is now shared across the entire service team.
Okay, so how is that to get deeper into that experience? So let's say the field technician goes out to the field and they're capturing data. Are they capturing data onto your system directly? Or I mean, when they go write these notes or capture, what are they capturing and how are they capturing that information?
Yeah, they're capturing it within our system directly within Subatomic. Basically, we built a UI. That's what they preferred, but it could have been headless, where it could have still self-guided them through the steps of collecting information, diagnosing, pulling up the right information to identify root cause. But it was through a UI that stepped them through a workflow. And depending upon the
So is
nature of
it
the
so is
service,
it like an iPad app, for instance, or is it like
yeah, we made it
iPhone app?
mobile ready from day one, and they use tablets.
Okay,
Sometimes
got
mobile
it.
phones, but often tablets as well. And so the intent was to be universally form factor ready and to do it their way, which not only was based on that initial cognition that led them through standard, workflows, but depending upon the nature of the situation, it would self-guide them dynamically depending upon that category.
So they're capturing data into, let's say they go into your mobile app on iPhone or the iPad, they're entering data and details, maybe they're taking photos, maybe they're capturing some videos, they stick it, and that essentially, since you're running it in the customer's infrastructure, that data is going into their data stores, whether it's Postgres, whether it's Data Lake, whether it's Snowflake, doesn't matter. That data lives in their own world essentially. Now, once the data is submitted, what are some next things that happen there in the workflow?
So once all the information is collected, including, you know, I'm glad you alluded to the multimodal aspect of this: pictures, videos, and descriptive text for, again, problem diagnosis, readings, root cause analysis, resolution applied in a chronological way. Our AI then auto generates a report that is based upon their preferred practices. And there were a few of their technicians that guided exactly what should be adopted company wide, that helped drive that AI synthesis. Again, we use agentic AI that can determine, even at a step-by-step level, of what needs to be done with the very specific guidelines and guardrails in place. And then the final assembly of everything into a formatted standard report is done as a final step within that chains event.
Makes sense. I'm going to ask you a rather silly question. I'm going to ask this because I've also been asked this many a times by many people. I don't necessarily think it's silly, but it might not be the most technical question someone's asked you. So here I go. Let's say we get a sense. Thank you for sharing a lot of those details, and we get 20 minutes in, have some sense for what your product offering is. So hopefully this question is not completely off the mark. So let's say we collected this data, we entered into the app that was provided by your company, and then it stores this data. It's got rich data because the more fields go into those, more agents go into those physical human agents go into the fields and get more data. You have richer and richer data, so you make able to make better decisions. Now the silly question I want to ask Karl is, a lot of times we have these tools like Claude, for instance, that have, you can pick the data model, the LLM, for instance, that you can work with, right? Some more expensive, some not so much. So there's a variety of plans that they do provide. What is the fundamental difference between that agent, right, going to the field capturing the data. Sure, they don't have an app, so they're going to have to capture it in text format, for instance. And let's say they stick it into something like Claude and asking it to make tell that person what needs to happen, be it diagnosis, be it something else, be it what next steps are, be it create a visual representation of this, or be it create a workflow. It does a lot of things, as we all know. So the reason I'm asking this question is not specifically to your product because I haven't seen it, but in general, because I do see a lot of the product offering come into play these days, which are sort of wrappers, if you will, on top of these existing models that exist. So there is this inconvenience of going into, say, ChatGPT or Claude. But if you were willing to do that, you actually did not have to use these other products, for instance. So just that's the context of the question. If you could just answer that either specifically from what you offer or even generically, it doesn't have to be yours, to how you see this being a problem or a non-issue.
Yeah, no, it's not a silly question. A lot of people get this confused, when they don't really understand how, if they don't just go directly into Claude and develop a prompt, that is even rigorously defined, what is the big difference? This is where the agentic harness becomes critically important. A lot of the responses, even if you provide a lot of instruction, basically gets much lower accuracy levels. If you ever look at the benchmarks, you'll notice that even the best ones aren't like 80% or 90% and above. And so having a good agentic harness, which can break down your overall instructions across a set of steps and actually reference knowledge or cognition on the fly, which may be too complicated to type in within a prompt. The difference is if you have a complex challenge, and we at Subatomic focus on the complex, the multi-step workflows that cross systems, that cross organizational departments and the teams within. And we help eliminate all the friction that passes between information gathering across the teams and distributing it across the right people. It becomes automatic with the cognition that span that entire workflow. Now, that's something that's not easy to build into a structured step-by-step, and then within a step dive into branches of potential logic depending upon what the situation is. So that agentic harness is then further fortified with observability and security. At least from Subatomic, these are things that are first-class citizens within the harness that is part of the overall execution to ensure top performance, and the observability into the same, that it used your workflow steps, it used your reasoning, it came up with interim answers along to a final answer. And it actually is done for both the clients and for Subatomic. And when I say Subatomic, it's both for the Deep Lens AI coworker, that we call it Deep Lens, that actually evaluates, it performs all that auditing, and it self-corrects in the initial execution. And then you as a human being can actually also provide your feedback, and it course corrects both the cognitive reasoning in the knowledge graph and anything related to RAG retrieval processes. It's constantly optimizing. So then at the aggregate level, because that was just at the single request level or workflow execution level, we identify those patterns where there could be optimization that is across any of the things like accuracy, performance, faithfulness, consistency, standardization, costs. We use multiple models. You asked that earlier, and my apologies for never answering that. Whether it's the commercial ones like OpenAI, and they have multiple ones that are big and small, even for inference, let alone separate ones for embedding. Same thing with Claude. But we also use open source models where applicable. We define and actually at runtime determine the appropriate model for purpose fit assignment given the task that's needed, and also to ensure that we're not overspending or sending a small focused task to a big model unnecessarily, where it may not be as good as a small model that has been trained to very specifically address that singular task. So there's a lot
Makes sense.
there. In being sorry, I'll just wrap up this statement by saying sending it into one model is so self-constraining, not just for the results of the responses that come back, but the way you want to manage costs and make sure it's done in a standard way every time across your organization.
Fair enough. The next thing I want to ask you is, has there's many ways software engineering, as I see it, as somebody much like yourself, been doing this for multiple decades, changed. But I want to ask you about your thoughts, and here's my reasonably specific question. Say about, I don't know, a decade ago, right? You're building software. You approached the problem. You understood what your team or the client, if you're a managed services company, what they wanted to do, what their budget was, what skill sets they had in the team. If not, you brought your own resources, sort of had a hybrid mix of engineers and other folks who played different roles in the team, and went through a very traditional software development life cycle that I don't think had changed for a fairly long period of time. I mean, the technology's changed, the language has changed, the frameworks changed, but the core essence of how do you go about building software, at least, I'd not seen it fundamentally change up until not too long ago, right? Maybe the last 2 years, 3 years, or a year ago. I know it's changed quite a bit now, but that is less defined because I see it differently adapted by different companies based on the size of the company, based on the type of teams that they have, the geographical locations that they possibly happen to be in. So I feel my opinion is that we are in a state of flux to some extent. I mean, Bay Area is probably a slightly different world, but if you just get out of the Bay Area and you look at the rest of the world, I see a fair bit of inconsistencies even when we talk about software development lifecycle.
Mm.
So I have a few things to ask you there, but at the offset, are you seeing that, like, in other words, for your team, for instance, has the SDLC changed from how it may have been maybe like 2, 3 years ago? Or do you think that core tenets of it have not changed much?
The core tenets have not changed much. You know, very specifically, when we hire for engineers within our team, we make sure they have the software engineering practices and disciplines. They need to know design patterns, data engineering patterns at its core. And then you can know better how to introduce AI into the overall flow. The practices are still the same. The optimizations you're trying to achieve through these patterns that are tried and true remain the same. But now you're just better understanding AI as a component within the overall end-to-end engineered flow.
Carl, I'm going to challenge you on that simply because I want to, one, play the devil's advocate, and two, I've actually had people tell me quite the opposite many a times. We live in a world where the separation between roles is becoming very thin, right? It's grayer, meaning I've had people on the podcast who've actually launched their products, not just gone to PO prototyping or proof of concept, but they've actually gone live or raised money and have paying customers, and they never wrote a line of code themselves, right? They've never written as non-technical founders. They never ever wrote code in their careers, and they don't even have a technical co-founder. And for instance, a lot of people tell me that they don't have actual developers in their teams, and they've wipe coded their way all the way through to production. Now, I don't know what that means because I don't come from that world, but I can tell you based on what I'm hearing, reading, and speaking to people, but that is happening. So my question to you would be, why do we need to know the fundamentals of computing? Why do you need a computer science graduate these days? Because if somebody is a good problem solver who knows how to take a problem, it doesn't matter what the problem is. It could be an engineering problem, it could be a food problem, it could be an insurance problem. If they're able to think, if they have the cognitive ability to dissect a problem in an industry that they might be unaware of, using a variety of these tools, why do we even need for them to have that experience in that space?
Well, that certainly isn't ideal, Krish. Ultimately, there are plenty of vibe coding success stories, but in reality, very few of them are can actually hold off the rigor of true production scenarios. They don't often catch all the different possibilities that reflect the true company's situation. And they're not often built with security and observability in mind. In fact, the vibe coded examples are quite often the most fragile out there. Now, the reason why I believe now you need the software development discipline is because while we are an AI, coworker engineering team mostly. Again, I said at the beginning, we're only 13 human beings. We have over 100 AI coworkers, predominantly in engineering, as we have two different internal products: Nexus for data engineering, Nucleus for the workflows that run atop. They get the entire code, those AI coworkers that live in those solutions, 80% of the way there. And then it's fundamentally a way of getting to the finish line. Now, in the engineering team, what that means is not just understanding the business problems that you're fulfilling and ensuring that you're delivering according to that, but it's also making sure that the AI coworkers were built in a way that ensured those best practices in the discipline, because otherwise they become fragile in the real world in production setting. So our individual contributors that were just core developers of the past become the managers of their AI coworkers. They need to make sure that the code is durable for all conditions, and then that assurance and that time frame is short. So I do recommend you have engineering, strong engineers that can ensure that if you vibe code, you should at least have someone check over that code for you. So vibe coding may eventually get to a point where the software discipline is already embedded in the auto coders, but you do need someone to ensure before you roll something out for a client. Otherwise, you put yourself at big risk.
Thank you for that. It is quite reassuring. I wanted to hear that because I agree with everything you've said there. But I just want to sort of assess both sides of it because I read something the other day where, programming in the next maybe couple of years is going to become like assembly language programming, right? I had never done that in my career because I started doing my first job at, I think it was a C programming job before I eventually moved to Java and whatnot. But I'd never, not even in college, I had done assembly level programming, for instance. In the next couple of years, it's possible. I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Maybe people never write code anymore, right? Maybe people just assess, review, fix, and adjust and tweak code that is being generated, but perhaps they're not going to write lines of code themselves, right? Till we come to a point that where maybe code becomes transparent. I also read something, I don't remember where, not too long ago, that said there could come a time, not could, there will come a time, just we don't know how long, it's 6 months out or 6 years out, that you don't ever get to see the code that actually is functioning, behind the scenes. Not even as a programmer, perhaps your job situation, maybe you do something differently. So there, and you also called out for something there, right? You said 80% of the code, if I'm not wrong, is actually, that is a slight change or a big change to the SDLC to a large extent, because you're not now getting business requirements from a business team and writing the first line of code like the hello world and getting started from there before you create your draft PRs and whatnot. It sounds like, a lot of the cases you have 80% of the code generated and then you start from there as an engineer. Now, the question also becomes, Carl, as to the 80% of the code that's being generated, that certainly does not have to be done by developers or architects. A business team can do it totally, right? So, what does it mean to the composition of engineering teams as you see them change? How are you seeing the shape of those teams be? I'm guessing it's not traditional developers and one tester, a part time product manager, and a DevOps engineer. A team structure that we've had for a long time probably is going away. What are some new structures that you're currently seeing in an engineering team?
Yeah, so I believe actually for the developers to also be the testers, as an example, but I'm going to share a few different things that I want to specify as an overall response. But if we start there, I believe in the idea that, again, we flipped the ratio of humans to AI coworkers in the engineering space. Again, even Subatomic a year ago had many more humans than AI coworkers. And now the ratio got flipped, and therefore we went from 10% or 80% human code generation to 80% AI coworker generation. And when you have fewer humans, they need to actually perform multiple roles because you're only going to be, you know, allocating, you know, a small set of your budget to human beings at that point, right? You're going to be spending eventually more on compute than human labor when it comes to engineering. But also, I believe in the idea of test driven coding. And if you make sure that you embed that into the AI coworkers that perform that, you specify the test conditions in which, upfront in which the code should be able to handle, then it's built the right way from day one. And holding engineers, the human engineers, as well as the AI coworkers that execute these guidelines and guardrails accountable is critically important. When you separate testing into a different person as as a sole role, you actually, remove accountability and responsibility from the actual coder. And I don't believe in that. But there's a lot more going on. Again, I think today you're right. Business coders, business users can define the features and logic and the test conditions functionally, that should be met. But you do need the technical conditions to also be met. And so the inputs that go into the AI coworkers out of discovery is both functional and technical in nature, and they both feed in to the first team in that AI coworker assembly line, which starts with the planning and design aspects before the build begins by the next AI coworker team, and then eventually testing on that test-driven, designed approach of engineering the code.
How are you mentioned an interface, right? You mentioned React. You mentioned the field, the agent actually going in and collecting data from when they go on site. How are these interfaces changing? We one of our products is a project management software, snowpal.com, and people have asked me, Krish, how would the design look like if you were to have designed it today? Would it be different, and how different? And my answer was like, I didn't even have to think for a second before I said it would be 180 degrees different, right? We built it like 4.5 years ago, but the world was a different place. We would do it quite differently today. So, are you seeing, like in your example of that app, is it a traditional type of interface, Carl, where people go in, there's drop downs, all kinds of objects, UI objects where they interact with? Or is it conversational where they just have a prompt? Maybe they write what they've found, what they've not found, what they're thinking, and then it actually auto populates into fields that's transparent to them. They are quite radically different approaches. I want to know where you've seen people lean towards these days.
Yeah, what's interesting is we began with a headless chat interface only. And a lot of people love that, including our flagship client in wealth management that actually became a lead investor. And then we ran into clients that, in addition to that, they wanted a dashboard. That, for whatever reason, it brings comfort because of the familiarity. Now, where we differ on this is we don't just provide a hybrid approach where you get the true headless experience of chat, which can actually be not just directly accessed through Subatomic, but through your typical chat interfaces like Slack, Teams, Google Chat, whatever, text, email. You can access what we call the Subatomic Chief of Staff that knows all the AI coworker teams that exist for your different use cases anywhere you like to do work, which improves the adoption rate. But yet, when people want to see visualizations of things, we wanted to not just deliver what they felt comfortable knowing, you give me all this, for sure out of the box, you build it for me like this, but we wanted it to be dynamic. That was important. And so you can ask any question in the chat. It will dynamically give you a breakdown of everything you need textually and auto-generate a visual dashboard for key metrics that support the answer that you got. So that is a key difference. And it's, again, always with a cross-cognitive understanding across your different services, for example, that is a complex relationship that needs to be carefully built. But that is what we bring to surface, again, wherever you like to work.
I've worked with a number of wonderful UI UX engineers in my career, right? Some really good, smart people. who design these interfaces like I could never imagine doing. But I, even if the outcome of end result of what they did was remarkable, sure, but the approach they all took to getting to the destination was not necessarily very different, meaning they followed good practices, the best practices in their own industries as to, hey, how do I take the problem, how do I understand the clientele, the demographic and whatnot, and the personalities and the styles of the end users, humans, and let me build something that makes the most sense for that team or that set of people.
Yeah.
But now it's changed because the consumers are not just human, there's more and more agents going to exist. So there's this conversation around, okay, who are you building your sites for? And Google's conference, I think one of the things they mentioned yesterday was how their search is changing after, like, I think quarter of a century, and how maybe the way they're going to index is probably going to change. And this talks about SEO being dead or not being dead, much like SaaS being dead and not being dead, and so on. But the thing I want to sort of understand is, how do you think UI and UX should be approached, given the fact that it's not going to be built just for humans, that you're going to be having to design them? Because these websites, I was talking to a podcast guest the other day, and he mentioned these markdowns that you need to have for each of your website pages, because agents are not going to look at noisy HTML pages. They would rather look at markdowns like .md files, so they can actually make a judgment really quickly when a question is being asked. So how do you see user experience and user interface change and adapt to a world that's a combination of both humans and agents?
Yeah. I'm going to first finish out a clear understanding of the human part, but and then extend out to the human and agents, both as potential consumers. Again, I'm going to echo it intentionally. We believe that whether it's an agent or a human, you dynamically need to actually adjust to the specific audience member, whether it's business or technical, you know, and and build it specific to the request itself. And so we do believe in the idea of dynamic display, and independent of how you initiate it, and again, from where you may have initiated it, from different communication channels, a human, Slack, Teams, like we talked about, it will actually reliably give you a dynamic response contextually relevant to what you just asked. And it doesn't need to be static anymore. That's key. But then when we extend to agents, I think you hit on it, Krish. I mean, the markdown representation is highly consumable for agents as well. I mean, I think, early on, information was being passed using JSON, but, ultimately, the models didn't necessarily be able to infer and properly synthesize with JSON. The outputs coming back were unreliable as well. Large language models do much better with Markdown as the format. And so when you send pass things across agents, whether it's an internal agentic scenario or you're working across maybe a supply chain and you're doing agent to agent communications, you need to actually structure the information in the best way that the audience member can consume. But again, it should work dynamically across a series of functions that the agents, just like a human being, would have access to. So there is still a nature of whether it's human or agent to do RBAC based security and have a registry of tools or functions that are accessible for that particular caller.
I asked you about team structure earlier, right, Carl? Just touching a little bit upon that one more time. As we have this conversation, Meta started announcing the layoffs. I don't know which layoff is this for the year for them, but it's N number, right? They're letting off 8,000 people, and then you hear this all the time. Amazon, I think AWS announced that not too long ago. So we are seeing this happen in real time, right?
Yeah.
And you're in the Bay Area, so I don't know how the mood is different there, because typically all of these end up coming from there, right? A lot of the direction happens to be coming off of that part of the world. So, and I've talked to people who've said they had 50 people in the team, they have like 8 people now. Two sides to the argument. One is, I can have the same number of people in the team, get more stuff done. That makes sense, but maybe if that's the case, AWS and Meta don't have dearth of stuff to do. If anybody has money and a lot of things to do, it's those companies. I have to reckon, right? I have to believe. So, how do you see this pan out? Do you think? I mean, what do you think is the genuine number of people you need in terms of percentages compared to say 3 years ago? If you had a team of 100 people, how many do you need today to get that same stuff done?
That's a hard question to answer, Chris, because it's always a function of if you overhired to begin with, right? Everything is really an outcome. I mean, it should be a function of how much work you have to get done today. And so, even before considering the impact that AI has on how many human beings should be doing it, you need to understand, how many individuals need to perform. Now, this conversation ladders back to the idea of higher AI, not software, and where AI is now replacing human labor. There's no doubt that if for today you had the right number of human beings before the introduction of AI replacing, yeah, you may be reducing the uh, the number of human beings in your, in your group, to a fraction of what it was. For us, I mean, in the engineering space, we actually probably cut at least 3/5 of our human need of what we needed to do by now. And so we never hired beyond what we knew we were going to need when we used AI and adopted it into Nexus and Nucleus. For other departments, it depends. I mean, we know coding is, engineering is one of the hardest hit ones. The managers across different teams, because now AI can actually bring together unified understanding through data and cognition. You don't need to actually run things up different managerial levels, which has always been interestingly analogous to the system level friction of passing information that isn't unified. It was always a point of friction that impacted both accuracy and timeliness of getting the information to the right people. Now those are getting, the friction across those levels are getting eliminated. So I think managerial levels, especially mid management, is hit probably just as hard as coders, which means that maybe 80% of mid managers, like director levels, maybe even senior manager levels, may be removed, for, you know 8 out of every 10. If not today, maybe as soon as 2028.
And at a personal level, or maybe even at a professional level, Carl, what are some tools that you had used in the past, maybe 3 years ago? Let's take 3 years because it's a good window of time, that you don't seem to have a need for anymore because of maybe Claude or ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever it is that's helping you do stuff that you somehow decided that, you know what, these are tools that I used to use. I have some like that. I'm just curious. Are there some tools that you would have used quite consistently 3 years ago that you don't actually ever find value for today?
Well, it's funny because I'm going to use an example which is almost counterintuitive to someone who's performed data engineering for a good part of his career. The whole spreadsheets usage is just never. Decades ago, we were, there were future predictions of the demise of the spreadsheet, and people will use databases and interact through a simple user interface. And now, maybe actually preparing spreadsheets is one of the key things that, if you work directly with a model like Claude, OpenAI, or even Google Gemini, you can have them you know, infer an existing spreadsheet and then augment or evolve that spreadsheet for you. So presentations, all the typical office productivity software, which is really singular task focused, you can just use models and gain productivity and eliminate your need to use those, or at least, you know, update these types of, information, docs, Excel presentations, you name it. But for complex workflows, I'm finding it at the overall system level. Those individual SaaS players across CRM, ERP, even domain specific applications become less necessary because you can actually, through an AI solution, again, it's subatomic, we offer it accessible in many different ways. You don't have to go into those systems. At minimum, you're reducing your licenses and therefore the number of users, because that's always typically usage based price, or sorry, user seat licensing, right? You can reduce your costs. You can potentially even eliminate a system. So, for example, we at Subatomic evaluate CRM systems. We decided, why do we need it? We have AI coworkers who can build one for ourselves, and we do. We're an AI first company, so we actually utilize very few external SaaS systems that are domain specific or function specific, and just build it ourselves. So that's my experience, and I'm sure many other companies are going to have that same experience too. You referred to the SaaS apocalypse earlier, and whether or not that will come to fruition, we believe it will. And we see already evidence for our personal use and other companies that are becoming very interested in the same.
So, Carl, as we get to the tail end, I have one or two questions, and I'll let you ask me anything if you have something to ask me, and then I'll have a final question for you. So, one of the next things we are doing as a company is building a fintech API. We are an API store. We publish APIs, help other companies build software quicker. And in the context of that fintech API, some of us spend a fair bit of time in the stock market. So this is not financial advice, just so I tell our audience, or just for educational purposes. But I'm curious, if you had $100, somebody gave you $100 for free, and they gave you a list of companies that you could actually invest in, meaning buy a stock, right? I'm going to give you a few companies, and you can only pick one, no diversification, right? Just you pick one of these, whatever comes to my mind right now. I want to see which one it might be, right? So here I go. I'm giving you $100, and you're going to have to pick one. And I'm going to run through a list. Bear with me until I finish that list. Micron, Workday, Salesforce, uh, Intuit, Atlassian slash team, the ticker symbol, NVIDIA, Microsoft. I can think of some more. Maybe I'll add one more to the list. Shake Shack for fun. These are the list of companies. You've got $100. You can pick one. Which of these? You might say none of these, but if you were to choose one of these, which one might it be?
If I had to choose one, I would either bet on those who are, you know, selling AI at strong clips. So NVIDIA, NVIDIA and Microsoft's involved, but I'll be honest, I wouldn't know who I would pick because I haven't done an evaluation of their current stock price. I don't know how much of forward-looking earnings and revenue is already baked into the price, but the companies that I believe will be around and surviving, I'll answer more in that context
Sure.
without knowing the right price to pay with my $100. Shake Shack.
Because is it because you think there's got to be people have to eat no matter what happens? There's a need for
It's
humans to consume food.
it's a sure thing, and I believe there'll be, through robotics, AI that makes the operational aspects of top tier fast foods accessible. Now, I'm assuming Shake Shack is a top tier still. I know it's a well known brand, but honestly, I don't mean to say that instead of the key AI companies. By the way, I'm pretty sure NVIDIA and Microsoft will definitely be around just as well. But I'm assuming they are way overpriced without knowing for sure at the moment.
Fair enough. The last question for you, and then you can ask me anything you want to ask me, is let's say you're going out for dinner. What would be your order of appetizer, entree, and dessert be? It all does not have to be part of the same cuisine, just one dish from each of these three categories.
Wow. All right. So for a starter, and I'm not always a starter eater, by the way, I'm usually a single course entree person. But if I did the three courses, probably octopus, some sort of grilled octopus would be my starter. It could be a really good arugula salad with a light dressing, but
Okay.
something like that. The entree would probably be a sea bass, maybe again grilled with some sort of Greek, Italian, or other Mediterranean type of preparation. And dessert, yeah, I think it would have to be a delicious molten lava chocolate cake.
That's good. I have a feeling there are not enough Indian people in the Bay Area because you didn't pick any Indian dishes there. No, I'm just kidding.
There, there's a lot of fantastic Indian cuisine, by the way. You know, I love all the curries. So,
No, no worries. I'm just messing with you. Do you have anything to ask me, Carl? I know I asked you a bunch. Is there anything you want to ask me?
yeah, what would you choose for the three-course meal?
Yeah, you could ask me anything else as well, but I'm happy to answer that one because nobody's asked me that before. I come from the southern part of India. I lived most of my life in the US now, but my formative years were in Chennai. I was born in Chennai. So my favorite food is basically South Indian food. I don't know if you've seen it. It's called rice cakes. It's those little white rice cakes that you have with different chutneys. The chutney is the selling point essentially. That can be had for breakfast, lunch, or dinner as an appetizer or an entree. It's just how many of those you end up eating. And then there's a different variation to that similar batter, but it's a crepe. It's called dosa, where it's you might have seen it's like a pancake, but it's flat and it's much bigger. I think they make a billion of those every day in the world, and
Mm,
it's like French fries or pizza, extremely popular. So those would be my choices any day. I could eat them all day long, except it would have to be made either in India or in Singapore, or if I don't go that far, at least in UK. The Indian food in the US, in my opinion, is horrible. So
wow.
I can pick any here, but that would be. And then for dessert, is something it's like a round donutty things called gulab jamun. So I would go with that for
No.
dessert. Yeah.
Sounds like I need to make a trip to get real Indian food.
Yeah, at least to Singapore. If you don't go all the way or you go that far, might as well go to India. Singapore's got some phenomenal South Indian food. I think almost the best. Other than outside of India, I think the best South Indian food you could have is in Singapore.
Fantastic. I'll ask you one more question, and maybe you could be as selective or as comprehensive as you want in the response. For all the topics that we talked about, which ones do you have an interesting, different perspective on?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay. Do you have another 3 minutes or so for me to answer that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
happy to stay.
So I don't know if it's a different perspective, and it's not even a question of agreement or disagreement, but I'll just tell you from what I've learned by having hundreds of these conversations with other distinguished guests, such as yourself from different parts of the world, right? Mostly the US and some in Europe, but I've also talked to people, not as many at this point, but in South Asia and in Australia as well. So the answers sometimes tend to vary, again, by geographical locations. There's similarities of when you talk to folks in the US, but again, between the West Coast, particularly the Bay Area and the rest of the country, I mean, I can sense some differences, some remarkable differences as well, right? So here is what I would say. Uh, I have my biases because I grew up as an engineer. My whole career has been doing engineering work. So when somebody says, "Do we need developers anymore?" part of me is like in denial, right? It's just natural human instinct. But part of me, as somebody who's running a company, no, I'm not in denial. And I know that as we look to build new software, Carl, the whole approach to building it has changed more so than I've ever known in my life. And I've only been building products in my career. So I've mostly been at the cutting edge of technology for the most part. Right? I used to work for Oracle in my first job. Mostly 90% of my work is product work per se. So, and I've always picked the right set of tools and technologies, right? Even if I'm saying so myself. So it's not like I felt like things were moving slowly, but things have started moving a lot quicker now. And things have started changing because the number of people I talk to who've never written code, who are actually in the business of building software, is an incredible number. And it's kind of amazing too because it's software has certainly been democratized. It's not, you don't need to know algorithms, you don't need to know programming, you don't need to understand n-tier architectures, right, to get into this business of engineering, which is kind of cool because I didn't think it was possible, but it is possible. But at the same time, I don't know where that line is between, hey, I've gone live without really understanding what code is being run. Because AWS said they had outages like a month or two ago, and they attributed some of those outages, if not all of them, to it being AI generated, if I'm not wrong. And they required that some senior engineer or somebody in the team has to approve of what is being generated. But as Claude becomes smarter and smarter, and I love the Claude co-founder, he speaks beautifully, right? He speaks to both sides. You have to believe that these tools are improving dramatically, meaning the skills that a lot of us believe we have as engineers, I strongly feel like it's going to become a commodity in a year or two from now. I strongly believe that, even as somebody who's in that business, which means what you end up wanting to build has to be different from what you might have wanted to build in the past. How you want to approach the building of that software has to be quite different too. And how you differentiate yourself from other competitors, what your actual moat is going to have to be redefined, because writing a lot of good code is not a moat anymore. I mean, having good architecture is not a moat anymore, because a lot of tools can do it for cheaper and much quicker. And I've myself not seen me use certain tools that I'd used in the past. Like Canva is a tool that I'd use quite a bit. I like the company, like the founder for all the struggles she had as an Australian. So the whole story was beautiful, and I like the product as well. But I can tell you, in the last 12 to 16 months, I've found we're paying for subscription, but I don't even know how many times we've actually gone to Canva, because we don't seem to find the need there. Similarly, there are a lot of tools that we had used in the past which we never seem to want anymore, and there's a new set of tools we end up needing to go to. So I think there's a fundamental shift in the world, right? It's like an inflection point. Either whether you agree or disagree. The reason I asked you about those companies is, Micron is one of those companies that's gone up like 1,000% in the last 8 months, right? And I've seen that founder a couple of times in DC, actually, Sanjay Mehrotra. It's amazing, and people are saying it's going to probably even go up even more so, because the need for memory is increasing. From what Jensen Wong had mentioned, he was had a chat, I think, with the was it the ServiceNow founder or somebody else who's talked with him. No, the Dell, Michael Dell, and him were in a chat like a couple of days back, and he mentioned about memory. So there's one part of the world that believes in AI going to be changing things fundamentally, where you can put every $100 you have and borrow $100 and put that into AI. And I also talk to people who believe in this but are rather skeptical. They're worried about these crazy valuations. Some people say the forward P does not matter. It's growing so much. It's like Palantir, or I don't know, SanDisk has gone up 3,000% in a year. You don't care. Borrow your money, put it in these companies. You're going to retire soon. I think each part of the world is split. As I see, the world is split there, and each camp feels very strongly, right? For every Michael Burry who says I'm shorting Palantir or Nvidia, there are tons of people buying that as well. And sometimes you're wondering where you want to be, and that's why I talk to my guests and try to figure out how comfortable they are in the business they are in. Are they going to be changing careers and things of the nature? So not so much to agree or disagree, but here are the bunch of learnings I've essentially have had, and people telling me that, yep, Krish, I've gone live. I don't even have a developer in the team. My product's in production. And my first reaction, Carl, was OMG. How is
Yeah.
that? Is that even safe? What happens? You find a bug in production. How are you going to find somebody to fix it? How are you going to be answerable to your customers? Because when GitHub can have a hack, or somebody hacked GitHub, and it's scary, right? You probably saw the news where, I don't know, they were compromised. So you
Right.
talked about security, you talked about governance. A lot of those things are important, but just the list of those things that are important, I feel like it's going to change. We're going to worry about tokens, token management, how much money you're spending on engineers versus tokens. Maybe you want to spend more money on tokens versus developers. So those are the things that I think are beginning to change, and the way we solve problems is changing. So I think we're all going to exist hopefully in this space, but who ends up being successful and who ends up being needing to look for a different career purely depends on some huge gambles and risks that I think each of us are going to have to take. I think being playing it safe, in my opinion, Carl, is going to be the riskiest thing to do. I think that's just my 2 cents.
Yeah. Actually, fundamentally, you and I are 100% seeing it the same way. I But your reaction to someone putting in a production and being the accountable one if something is broken to their clients is the view I possess for today. It may be different in a year or two. I think it'll take time for that final 20% to be already built in for best practices of software architecture and design. Right now it's not versatile enough to handle the different situations and map it to the right selections of architecting and patterns that need to be present within the overall flow of information. So, but we'll get there. I have no doubt it's going to happen eventually, and it's sooner than later, meaning within 5 years I could put a high confidence level on, right? And that could be a small handful of that years. But right now, you do still, I really strongly believe you need someone to check the code and make sure you can be accountable, especially because you're in fintech. We're focused on fintech as well as other high compliance, high accuracy required outcomes and consistency, durability for all the scenarios. You have to be ready. You have to be accountable. You're a data processor for them quite often. So, for maybe some of the ones that variability and accuracy can survive imperfection, yeah, it could be easier to vibe code your way and handle downtimes because your system's not mission critical. Maybe it's a marketing application, But yeah, we are fundamentally aligned. Actually, it's the change rate is actually going parabolic, and it's only a matter of time.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to let you have the closing comment, but and also please stay on the call for a minute after we are done here. Again, folks, thanks to Carl Simon. Carl's the CTO of Subatomic. We'll include the link to Carl's LinkedIn profile and to get subatomic.ai, the company homepage. So you can definitely check that out. That said, Carl, take it away. Your closing comment.
Yeah, no, thank you for everyone who listened into the podcast. Feel free to, DM me through LinkedIn if you want to connect, talk shop, explore opportunities that maybe we could be extremely helpful for. And again, if it we're our URL is getsubatomic.ai. So there's a get in front. We're call to action oriented here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Carl. Much appreciate your time.
Likewise. Thank you, Chris.